Doug, tell me about this presentation today and how you got involved in it.
Okay, back when Guy Davenport was honored by posthumously becoming a member of the South Carolina Authors Honors, the group of us started meeting together and reading and discussing his writings and whatever. And we've been doing that, I don't know, for a lot of years. And lately we discovered two other native Andersonians who became world-known authors, and they're just fascinating, all of three of them. And so we came up with the idea to sort of reintroduce them to Andersonians and Andersonians. And so we'll be talking about each of the three. Today will be an introduction to Guy Davenport and Joel Williamson. And then next week, we'll deal with Guy Davenport again and Clarence Brown, who taught at Princeton and was a Russian scholar. And they were lifelong friends, communicated by letters and phone calls all their lives. And so it will deal somewhat with their exchange of letters, too.
Is there going to be anything added to the museum about these guys as a result of this, or do we know yet? Or?
Not that we know of, but there might be, because Joel especially, I think, would qualify for the South Carolina Honors Group. He did a lot. He very obviously considered Anderson home and was took pride in the fact that he was educated in Anderson. So Guy Davenport, as I mentioned, has already been honored.
So when you were talking about y'all start talking about, was it an official group that did it, or just students?
Guy Davenport at one point said he thought he had 18 readers in the world, and so we called ourselves the Davenport 18. We never had 18 at one time, but
we decided to prove him wrong.
That's right.
And we did.
But it's been a wonderful group. His writings are, a lot of them, most of them are difficult reading, but they're worth the challenge. They're fascinating. And,
Thanks, Doug.
Sure.
We'll go ahead and get started here. Thank everyone for being here at the Anderson County Museum today. We appreciate everybody stopping in for this wonderful program. Make sure you join us next week, Tuesday, same time, same place, for part 2. So I'll go ahead and pass it over to our speakers here. Who would like to be first?
John.
Yes, I have.
Here's your microphone.
Okay. Tell me, can you hear?
Yes.
Okay, good. I'll try to remember not to let it go down by my side. I'm going to stick to a script, and sometimes that puts me off when I'm listening to somebody, but I think if I don't, this might keep us here until, what, 2:30 or 3? Anyway, here it is. The script says, "Good afternoon and welcome to the Anderson County Museum. We're delighted you decided to attend this event despite having to venture out into the bitter cold." Well, I think today is not as bad as yesterday was. Let me introduce myself. I'm John Lassiter, a native of North Carolina who came to Anderson 40 years ago to teach at what was then Anderson College and is now, of course, Anderson University. 4 years ago, I retired. Praise the Lord. Having logged 36 years at AU as a professor of history. When asked what I'm doing in my retirement, my first response is a phrase that comes from the poet Wordsworth, 2 words, and we have to save this discussion until later, but the words are holy, H-O-L-Y, holy indolence. And it's become my creed. I'll send you the poem that it comes from. It's a beautiful poem. Anyway, that answer is quickly followed by saying that now I can happily devote time to a readers group called the Davenport 18. You've all now seen that title. This is a group that's committed to reading and discussing the works of the Anderson-born Guy Davenport. There he is, looking very solemn. The other two have such wonderful smiles, but he looks like he's deep in thought, which is where he frequently was. Mind you, the 18 does not refer to the number of members of the group. We won't disclose what that number is. It comes instead from Davenport himself, a modest man, he would have had us believe, who in a 2002 interview not only described himself, now listen to this, as a minor experimental writer, but also referred to his 18 readers, and sometimes that number shrank down to 13. I think Eric Reese did some kind of count, and 13 won, but we like the Davenport 18. Anyway, this readers group came into existence in 2016, which was the year that Davenport was posthumously inducted into the South Carolina Academy of Authors. And this happened, the founding of this readers group happened thanks to the lady sitting over there to my left, Harriet Ritchie. So I was going to tell you to stand up and take a bow, but you can wave to everybody and they can wave to you. Anyway, now something about our program. This is the first of two Tuesday noontime discussions devoted not only to the life and work of Guy Davenport, but also to two of his younger, I'm not sure that they necessarily look younger than he was there. His younger by 2 years. Davenport, you can see the dates. Davenport was born in 1927, and the two of them were born in 1929. These guys were at Anderson Boys High together, high school together. They were contemporaries who went on to become distinguished scholars and prolific authors. Joel, you'll hear about him from Doug Davison after I get finished with talking about Davenport. Williamson was a historian of the American South, who I'm proud to say taught at my alma mater, UNC Chapel Hill. I never had a course with him, which is something I regret, but he taught American history, and I just didn't do American history. I did English history, European history, anyway. Of course, Clarence Brown, a professor of Slavic languages who taught at Princeton University. Our goal, and I hope we succeed, is to connect these three men, not only to each other, but also to Anderson, South Carolina. Let me advance the screen here for a minute. Again, this is what I want you to ponder. Today's, I'll go ahead and I thought it was so small I might have to read it out loud to you. Can everybody see it? Or do you want to hear me read it? Okay, I will read it. This, incidentally, is not a quotation from Davenport. It is his, he's identified at the bottom. It's by Eric Reese, who is a remarkable person that is very elusive. We have tried to get in touch with him, hoping to bring him here, perhaps, to talk to our group, but he's sort of like Guy, a kind of recluse who is even a little eccentric. But here's what he said. Guy thought there were two kinds of genius. One that is cultivated by an enlightened society, think Mozart, and another that God simply drops in the middle of nowhere as a kind of cosmic joke. Think Joseph Cornell, and I await enlightenment from somebody as to why he qualifies as a genius. He was a filmmaker and an artist who was very original in his work and probably a little bit eccentric. I think that is one of the qualifications of being a genius. And Reese says, Guy's genius was of the latter sort. And here comes God's cosmic joke. He grew up in Anderson, South Carolina, surrounded by a family that loved him, but could make little of his talent or his very un-Southern, solitary nature. As soon as possible, he left Duke University, then Oxford, then Harvard, with 2 involuntary military stints in between. Anyway, I have to tell you what my wife Julie, who's sitting back there, said when she read that that last phrase. She says, "What's un-Southern about a solitary nature?" But then she added, thinking of her own family, I'm sure, she said, "I guess it's because we're always having family reunions." And I can testify to the truth of that. I've been to more family reunions than I could possibly count. Anyway, the reason I selected this, of course, is the title of the program. It's the genius of 3 sons of Anderson. And I think in one way or another, all 3 of them really do qualify. Today's program, and remember, we're coming back a week from today to learn more. Today's program describes Davenport and Williamson as kindred scholars. And Harriet and I went back and forth about whether that was the appropriate term. And she finally allowed me to do what she clearly didn't approve of. But kindred, the word kindred, they're not blood kin. Everybody needs to understand that. But, and I think many of you know this, they were kin by marriage. Guy's sister, Gloria, was married to Joel's brother, James. And so that made them what? Does that qualify them? No relation at all. Not even brothers-in-law?
But we have Lori here.
Yeah, anyway.
Who's skinned about all.
But I would argue we might also say kindred in other senses of the word. And if you know the hymn, "Blessed be the tie that binds," shall we sing a verse of that? It contains a line, the phrase that I think applies here, the fellowship of kindred minds. And these men really did. They came from the same roots, basically, and they knew each other. They were friends, especially Davenport, as we'll learn next week, Davenport and Brown. And so I think they were, for sure, kindred spirits. Anyway, let's move to Davenport. And again, I'm going by the script so that I don't keep us here too long. My goal is to give you a very, emphasis on very, brief overview of his life and work, followed, if time permits, when somebody says that, you have to watch it up, if time permits, by 2 equally brief samples of his writing. And if I run out of time, I'm going to try to squeeze them in on next Tuesday. Well, where to begin? I thought I might start with a couple of questions for you to be answered by a show of hands. So we won't poll here, but first, really it's 2 questions. First, how many of you keep your car radio tuned to NPR? Okay, there are a few what do we call them, eggheads in here. The second question is, if you do keep your car radio tuned to NPR, you have, I'm asking, how often have you heard that a particular program is sponsored through the generosity of the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation? And those spots, I need to see some nods here. You recognize that? It's followed by their lovely mission statement, and I'm quoting it: "We are committed to building a more just, verdant, and peaceful world." I ask because one of the ways this philanthropic foundation has distributed its wealth, and I mean it was a vast amount of money when this was created back in the 1970s. The MacArthur Fellowship is often referred to, we're back to this word up here, as the MacArthur Genius Fellowship, but that's not a part of the official title, but that's the reputation that it has earned. These are distributed. This is the wealth of the MacArthur family distributed among people. The only restrictions on becoming a fellow are that, and I'm quoting from them now, nominees must be either residents or citizens of the United States and cannot hold elective office or advanced positions in government as defined by statute. Their website boasts that since 1981, 1,153 creative individuals have been named a MacArthur Fellow. And that averages out to just under 27 fellows a year. 27 American citizens who have the good reputation of not being a politician. And last year, they gave it to 22 people. You can go online and see them and what they have accomplished. By now, I'm sure you've guessed why I've told you about the MacArthur Fellows Program. Yes, you're right. In 1990, Guy Davenport was a recipient of this prestigious Genius Award in the category of literature. At least financially, this represented the peak of his career. According to the New York Times, in that year, grants were awarded to 36 individuals. Now think about that, nationwide, 36 individuals, all of whom, and I quote, will receive awards from $150,000 to $375,000 and can spend, this is still in quotes now, can spend the money as they choose. Davenport's award was $365,000, and he chose to spend that money by retiring from teaching at the University of Kentucky in Lexington, where he had been teaching since 1963. And I feel his pain there. He even considered giving up writing, but we're thankful that he didn't. I don't think Guy could have ever given up writing. This points to the fact that the quickest way to summarize Davenport's life is to take you rapidly through the stops along the path of his long academic career. Now, I want you to take notes on this. This is going to be on the quiz. He was, and I'm talking about his academic career both as a student and as a professor. That path begins, of course, in Anderson, where he was born on November 23rd, we need to go back to the pictures, 1927, into a family of modest means. His father was a Railway Express shipping agent. Their home can still be seen at 303 East Franklin Street. Just go out from the library, turn right and go down, what would it be, Fant Street? And if you go all the way down Fant Street, you come eventually to East Franklin? I think you do.
I'm sorry. Is he getting?
And then turn right on Franklin Street, and you'll come to the house. Anyway, his education was, and I think this is a very important part of the story, in Anderson Public Schools, including Boys High, but only until he was 16. Now try to imagine this. Your 16-year-old son decides, I've had it with high school here, and he did graduate. I owe this piece of information to Doug, who read about it in Bill Bland's history. Is Bill? He's not here. His history of Anderson High School. As the quotation from Reese says, he did this as soon as possible. He left for Durham, North Carolina, where shortly after his 17th birthday, he was allowed to enroll at Duke University, where he obtained a bachelor's degree in English and classics. From Duke, Davenport, and I'm going to move rapidly through this, lest you wonder when it's going to end. From Duke, Davenport went as a Rhodes Scholar to Merton College, Oxford, where he received a B.Lit, a Bachelor of Letters, I think that stands for, in 1950. Harriet's husband, Tom, if we call on him, can tell you about his Seeing Guy's thesis, isn't that correct? When they were in Oxford. And the interesting thing is the thesis was on James Joyce. And it was the first Oxford thesis on that work. It was on Ulysses. And if you've read and understood Ulysses, you can do one of these programs for me. Davenport's academic career, as Reese alludes to, was interrupted by military service in the Army, the Army's 18th Airborne Corps at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, now renamed Fort Liberty, which he considered to be very much a part of his education. God spoke highly of the training that he got in the Army. This was followed by his first teaching job. He was in the Army 2 years. His first teaching job at Washington University at St. Louis, which he held from 1952 to 54. And then it was on to Harvard. Now imagine, are you keeping up with this? Duke first, then Oxford, and now Harvard. That happened in 1955 for the doctorate that would enable him to obtain a more secure faculty position at a major university. As with his Oxford thesis, Davenport's Harvard doctoral dissertation would also be a first. This was the first dissertation on the cantos of Ezra Pound, the poet Ezra Pound, and that was the beginning of a long relationship between Davenport and Pound. They became lifelong friends. There were certain topics they didn't talk about because they disagreed on them, but if you know much about Pound, that he would have been a difficult person, and I guess Guy would be too, to be close friends with. Anyway, while living at Cambridge, and this is, I've tried to decide whether it was appropriate to include this, but while living at Cambridge, Davenport experienced the sadness of a short-lived marriage. He comes across as being very much an independent bachelor, but he married, this marriage lasted from 1956 to 1958, when his wife sued for a divorce, which was finalized in 1959. And he wrote about this to his friends. I got the information from a letter that he wrote to Hugh Kenner. But anyway, he never brought it up in public places like in the interviews that he gave that would be, appear in magazines and journals. Anyway, when it came to this is important to hear, when it came to his private life, Davenport was a very private man. When asked in an interview, is anyone writing your biography? He answered, I have no life. And one of his mottos, which I'm tempted to adopt myself, borrowed from the ancient Greek philosopher Epicurus, and it was 2 words: live unknown. Live unknown. And some people maybe need to take that advice. I think that's a very important part of who Guy Davenport was, a very, very private man. Anyway, we're not done with this academic career. Sorry. In 1961, with his Harvard PhD in hand, Davenport obtained a teaching position at Haverford College in Pennsylvania, and this position lasted 2 years. Now, you'll be relieved to know that in 1963, he finally settled down in Lexington at the University of Kentucky, where he eventually became distinguished alumni professor of English and began to secure his reputation as a writer. He didn't like teaching. I'm deviating now from the text, watch out. He wrote a good bit about teaching, and it's not always a positive experience for him. He declared that high schools don't teach anything, and so the students came to him totally unprepared, and he was appalled by the fact that they didn't know certain important writers. But anyway, as noted earlier, he retired from that position. Now we're talking about 1963 to 1990. He retired in 1990 after he got the MacArthur Award, and from then until his death, really, he devoted his time almost exclusively to writing, which is what he wanted to do. He did not give up writing. This part of his life's story would be incomplete if I didn't mention that it was in Lexington where he established a lifelong friendship with Bonnie Jean Cox, Bonnie Jean Cox, C-O-X, who held both administrative and teaching positions at UK. She served as the director of the university's library collection development department, and she also taught in the Women and Gender Studies program and briefly served as its director. So she was very important in her own right. I think some people just see Bonnie Jean as this companion of Guy. She outlived Guy by 12 years. She died in 2017. The Davenport 18 had been founded by that, and it was June Hopkins who broke the news to us that she had died. She had dementia. She was at Alzheimer's. And almost as soon as he died, she began to show symptoms of dementia. But anyway, listen to this. In her 2017 obituary, Davenport was listed along with family members who had predeceased her as, quote, her longtime partner and loving companion of nearly 40 years. It might also have been said that she covered for some of Davenport's eccentricities, if that's what you call his refusal to have a car, his refusal to drive, to even learn how to drive. He thought automobiles were the work of the devil. And he might have a point. Or if you call eccentric not having a television. Guy did not have a television in his house. But what am I getting ready to say? Whenever he needed to go shopping, he called Bonnie Jean, and she would come in her car and take him shopping. And same with the TV problem. He would go to her house. She lived 6 blocks away. They did not live in the same house. You need to understand that. He would walk the 6 blocks. So he was a great believer in walking. And they would watch DVDs and videos, remember videos, on her television. So, so much for guys not believing in cars and TVs. What many of his letters disclose is that Bonnie Jean drove him around when he needed to go shopping. And this turns up, June gets mentioned in the Kenner correspondence, and it was Guy telling Hugh Kenner about going shopping with Bonnie Jean for his I guess, nieces. Did he have nephews as well? Christmas presents for them. He would come to Anderson every Christmas. He was a good son. His mother, he came in the summer as long as she was living. Somewhere in here I have the year in which she died. Anyway, it should be also noted that in his travel journals, and this, I'm sure, this dates from after he won the MacArthur Award, when he could afford to travel. And they took a trip to Denmark. If you know anything at all about Davenport's fiction especially, you know that he was in love with Denmark. He thought Denmark, in many ways, had a more tolerant society than certainly the American South, he would have said. Anyway, while they were in Denmark, he kept a journal, and he records things like this. Bonnie Jean, the whiz at arithmetic, notes that our meal costs $80. That would have been maybe a lot of money, would it? Back then. Or he calls her BJ in the journal. BJ is a bit disturbed by so much drunkenness, and he's referring to the drunkenness of young kids, underage kids. And all that Davenport could say back to her was, I point out that they're not drivers. They're wonderfully on foot. And he was himself a great walker. Now, when it comes to Davenport's works, time permits only a listing of the many forms his creativity took. I should begin by stressing that Davenport was both, get this now, an accomplished artist as well as an accomplished writer. We sometimes overlook his artwork. These pursuits date from his earliest days in Anderson. Now listen to this. In an interview, he says, I studied drawing and painting at Anderson College, and Doug told me about that as well. When I was in grammar school, he was actually grammar school age, but he was going to Anderson College. He calls it private tuition. And Clarence Brown was also there doing the same thing with him. He says Brown was his fellow student. Elsewhere in the same interview, he says, and I love this, when I was 12, I published a daily newspaper, Hectographed. Can anybody tell me what that means? Hectographed. You don't know. It's some way of duplicating it. Hectograph. The Franklin Street News is what it was called. And that, to me, might be referring to Franklin Street in Chapel Hill. But no, he's talking about East Franklin Street in Anderson. Here's this guy still telling about it. It concerned itself with visits, birthdays, the births of kittens and puppies. In junior high school, grades 7 and 8, I wrote and drew for the local city newspaper and drew a series of sketches of old houses with their histories. I mean, this guy got started early. Throughout his career as a writer, Davenport continued to produce paintings and drawings, at one point illustrating some of his own stories. And he became irritated when editors would remove the pictures. His home in Lexington had a studio for the purpose of creating art. This was in the back of the house. Some people in here have been into Davenport's house. Did you see the studio?
Out back, right?
Yeah, in the back. In 1996, while Davenport was still living, Eric Rees wrote and published a book called, and I didn't bring it with me, A Balance of Quinces, Quinces. What are quinces, Eric? Do you know? What are quinces? A balance of quinces.
It's a fruit.
A fruit. Okay, good. I'm glad to be enlightened. And the subtitle is The Paintings and Drawings of Guy Davenport. And it's a beautiful book, and it's a lot of the stuff is in color. The paintings are in color, and you'll see a painting, an extraordinary painting that Guy did when we meet next Tuesday. Davenport's literary output was prodigious. In 2002, a little more than 2 years before his death, his friend and interviewer, John Jeremiah Sullivan, added it all up and reported that Guy had published 46 books of fiction, essays, and poetry. We sometimes overlook the fact that he was a poet. We've never read his poetry in the Davenport 18. Somebody has to be bold. We want Tom Johnson, if he ever sees this. Tom, hope you're listening. We wanted him to take that topic up. And it keeps going, not counting the many publications, many books to which he had contributed chapters and introductions. For 50 years, he has supplied magazines and newspapers with articles and reviews. He also listed, and this is an important part of his career, the ancient Greek authors that Davenport had translated, among them Sappho, Heraclitus, Diogenes, and Acreon. Those were the only ones I recognized in the list. More recently, and this is in the 1913 book that I've got a copy of it up here, and I think Laurie had one just now. Eric Rees, in the preface to his Davenport Reader, has written an eloquent assessment of this output. Listen, Guy Davenport was, I would argue, the finest prose stylist and most protean craftsman of his generation. He drew at once upon the most archaic and the most modern of influences to create lush experiments that often defy classification. And woven throughout that body of work is a radical and coherent philosophy of desire, design, and human happiness. And to this, Rees adds that he was, for one thing, a wildly comic writer, and I found that to be true. And for another, a moving eulogist. He wrote a beautiful obituary for Thomas Merton, who was his friend. Gethsemane is not all that far from Lexington, and he would visit Merton there. And when he died, in the National Review now, Guy wrote for National Review. He said he didn't agree with Bill Buckley's politics, but he wrote for the magazine. This beautiful, you should look it up, this beautiful obituary. And Rees finishes what I'm quoting, at least. He was a humanist and a moralist who believed that literature could encourage the best in a culture and stave off the worst. Think about that. Literature could encourage the best in a culture and stave off the worst. Here I must add that Davenport objected to being described as Southern author, and perhaps rightly so. Let me return to what Sullivan wrote in 2002. Again, quoting, born in South Carolina and having lived past 39 years in Lexington, Kentucky, Guy has spent most of his life in the American South, but it would be hard to imagine a writer for whom the regional tag embraced by or forced upon so many of his contemporaries is less appropriate. His milieu has always been the world. You know, Diogenes, whom he translated, Diogenes was asked, I think it was maybe by Alexander the Great, or some lofty person, he was asked, what is your polis? Meaning, what is your local community, your city? And Diogenes says, I am a citizen of the, sometimes it's translated world, sometimes it's translated universe. I am a citizen of the world, a citizen of the universe. And I think that's what Davenport was. It was certainly the audience he had in mind. He was not necessarily writing for a Southern audience about Southern topics. And what I have in my own text here is true, but I would argue that the path, this is sort of my thesis, the path to that milieu, the world, began here on East Franklin Street, and in the regions just beyond Anderson, where his family introduced him to books and stirred his curiosity about the wider world. The opening paragraphs of two Davenport essays, one of them is entitled Finding. It was published in 1978, and another one on Reading in 1987, I think begin to prove my thesis. I hope they invite you to find and read these short essays in their entirety. Now that is inviting you to get, can we talk about our books up here? Apparently we were supposed to bring books to, not to sell. Nobody, I forbid you to open any of mine. I don't want you to read my annotations, but you can see the titles up here. This is what I've been quoting from right here, the Davenport Reader, and you will find both of those stories in here. I'm not selling this book, mind you, but it's a very good, it's an anthology, a collection of his writings, and I think he's done, for the most part, a good job of picking out representative things of Davenport's. So it's that book. These other books I have up here, three of them, the Hunter Gracchus, they have names that require elaborate explanation. Every force evolves a form, and then finally the book he's best known for is a collection of 40 essays called The Geography of the Imagination, and I'm holding up what is a new edition of that. I don't know if McDowell's Emporium has got the new one yet or not, but this is the book you should get if you're wanting an introduction to the writing of Guy Davenport. It's all essays. There's none of his fiction in this book. Reese includes some fiction. I think somebody's going to tell me I don't have time to read these introductions. I was going to read them to you out loud. I have the texts of them right here. It's the first two paragraphs of each of these two essays, but I'm going to save them if Harriet gives me permission. Until, well, you're the one who's going on. You're going to do your piece on Tuesday of next week. So let's save those, and if you want to beat me to it, the library. I don't know. Does the Anderson County Library have a Davenport Reader? Do you know?
I doubt it.
Okay.
They have the.
Anyway, like I say, you can't borrow mine. I've written too much in there that might incriminate me. Anyway, what do we do? Questions? How do we have time for some questions or comments? There are people in here who perhaps have connections to these men, and I'm thinking of Davenport in particular. It kills me that when I moved to Anderson, he was still very much alive. He was coming to Anderson. I came in 1984. He was coming to Anderson. Did Mary die? And did you know the year of her death? His mother. Anyway, and the thing I pointed out to June and other members of the Williamson clan is that when Joel's father died, Carl English, who taught sociology, I know Joyce remembers Carl, and so does Doug. Carl English, who is somehow related to the Williamsons, he invited me to go to the visitation. It was at McDougall's, and I went with him. And like I said, I had never had a course with Joel. Joel didn't know me from Adam, even though I had been probably walking past his office. In fact, I even used his office when he was on sabbatical. It was a place called Henderson, South Carolina. That was the first time I had encountered the name of this town. But anyway, when I look back on that and wonder if it was possible that Guy Davenport had been in that very crowded room where other members of the family were somebody, I think it might have been, I don't know who, it was one of the Williamson kids, told me that he was not there. Davenport did not come all the way from Lexington to go to the funeral. So I missed my chance, but it always disappointed me that I didn't know about him while he was still living. Anyway.
I have one silly, it's a question we might need to go to later. You quoted his guy was the finest prose writer with lush experiments, desire, design, and human. It's a lovely tribute to him. Human happiness?
Human happiness.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm so glad to get that. Thank
you. Yeah, it's beautiful, and you'll find it right there in the Davenport Reader.
John.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Doug, are you going to?
Me,
okay,
just real quick.
Tell them what you're going to do.
I just want to introduce Lori.
Yeah.
So we have at least 3 Davenport 18 members who are not here today because of mobility issues. We have 2 others who are under the weather, but Mary Mills is here. Would you tell us your roundabout kinship with Guy Davenport?
Okay. My grandmother and his mother were sisters, and so that meant that my Guy and my father were first cousins. But my father was much older. He was born in 1906, and I believe Guy was born in 1926 or something like that. 27 or something. But he was, something that I think is humorous, if I can, was that Guy went to see Ezra Pound, wasn't it, in Spain. And I remember my father saying, since he was his 20-year older cousin, and of course he had a different perspective from Guy. My father was had a business here in Anderson. He said, what in the world is Guy Jr. going over there to Spain to see Ezra Pound? He doesn't need to be doing that, you know. So I think that Ezra Pound was a little bit on the political spectrum in opposite ends of my father. So I thought that was humorous that my father saying that. It's such a different perspective from what we look at. And of course, he was very proud of God, you know. But then he thought, well, he doesn't need to be going up there to Spain to visit Ezra Pound in prison. I think he was in prison, you know. So just tell that little funny story.
Thank you. So John has mentioned June Hopkins. Guy Davenport is her uncle. He was her mother Gloria's brother. And Joel Williamson is her uncle. He was June's father James's brother. Next week, I'm going to read some remembrances from June about both of her uncles. But we have in person Lori Williamson Allison. She's here. Hello. So Lori is also the niece of Joel Williamson and Guy Davenport. And Lori has told me about going to see her Uncle Guy, and because Lori has his artist genes, Lori actually, if you don't know, taught art in the District 5 system for 32 years, and 30 of those years she taught at Centerville Elementary School. So she's definitely got the genes, and she told me about going to visit him and him taking her to see his 2 Picassos and also a Buckmeister geodesic dome. And so thank you, Lori, for coming today. We're so glad. Yeah.
Did you see Lexington?
We did. Well, we did go 2 times, Mother and Jim and I, And the first time we went, he was well. And so, honestly, that's really the only adult conversation that I had with him. And, you know, he held court, and we listened and laughed and had a great time. And he still had his library and his art intact, and his living room was floor to ceiling books, but there were some shelves. So he did point out to me 2 little Picassos that he bought as a student, I guess, and he bought on the streets in Paris. And I don't know from where he got. I think Buckminster Fuller gave him the geodesic dome model. It was just a small one, but I was an art teacher, so I knew what they were, and I was very impressed. But then the second time we went to visit was when he was dying, and he was working on something, and I'm sorry that I can't remember exactly what it was. He could barely talk, but he knew enough to know us and knew that I was an art teacher, and so he made me come over closer and whispered to me that he had laid out in a chair in the den, almost like old school cut, copy and paste. And I don't remember what it was working on, but he said, "Your old uncle is still working. See this stuff." And, you know, I just walked and looked, and we did not stay very long that time because, you know, he was dying, and it was just not a great time. And Mother wanted to visit him, and so we did make an unannounced visit, but called Bonnie Jean when we got to Lexington. My brother went that time, to my mother, my brother, my sister, and myself. And she said, "Okay, give me an hour, you know, and then you can come." So that was a very brief visit, and I think he died like 3 days later. Anyway.
Thank you.
And, you know, I may be jumping ahead, but they sold all of his stuff, everything, the library, the books, the art, to a Texas Collections Museum. Which
University of Texas, Austin.
You can go. June and I keep saying that we're going to do it.
I'll go with you.
You can research. Well, I want you to go. You can research, and you have to tell them which bins that you want them to bring out for you to be able to look through. So, you know, I think, well, I know there's some of my, you know, childhood art that I would send him for Christmas, or I sent him a book one time. I presume to send him a book. And, I mean, but it had beautiful illustrations. That's why I sent it. So those things are there. You just have to make an appointment. What is the, I always
It's the
say,
Harry Vinson Center, and
Okay.
it is the biggest archive of American, or maybe authors in general, in this country. All of his papers are there, and we've accessed them. I ordered, and they'll give you a certain number of them free, so you should go sign up.
well.
You are listed. I've looked. You are listed as correspondence. Yeah. You're in a bin, Lori.
But I'm sure that I told people, my friends, that this before, or other people, when that subject would come up, and I saw, is it Sunday morning today that we lost? So Sunday morning show. They were going through. It didn't have anything to do with Uncle Guy, but they were going through that collections museum, and they had like Jackie O's white gloves, and you know, pulled out these storage drawers and had to put gloves on to take them out. So that's just my understanding of what exactly that was. And I believe, I'm pretty sure the stipulation was that no one could go until Bonnie Jean had passed. You could not. That's what I heard. That's what I remember. But, it was.
Thank you so much. So, Doug Davison is going to tell us of Joel Williamson.
Even before my brain got old, it was thimble size compared to John. So I don't have nearly the information he has. But it is my privilege to get to try to represent Joel Williamson and introduce him to you. He is a person, I would have been terribly intimidated to meet either of the other two people, but I feel like I might have really enjoyed being a friend of Joel. He was a renowned and beloved professor of history at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill for 43 years, from 1960 until 2003. He was known for his unique and compelling narrative style and groundbreaking studies of the American South. Personally, he was known for his kind, compassionate spirit. Long after his obituary had been posted, a former student found out that he had died, and he left a wonderful tribute to him. He said he had him in a class, but he was not a history major. He actually wanted to become a dentist, and he asked Joel if he would write him a letter of recommendation. And he spent time interviewing him so that he could do that well. And it was very telling, I thought. A little bit about his family. His father was Henry and his mother Carrie Mae. Prior to having children, they worked on a farm. They had an interest in a farm in the Pendleton-Clemson area, and it has now become part of the Clemson agricultural portion of the university. They were very interested in education from early on. Is this close enough? Are you hearing me? He, unlike some other farmers that he knew, took advantage of the agricultural educational material that Clemson provided. And so his crops had much better yields than the other farmers. And that interest in education worked greatly to the benefit of the children. At some point, they moved from the farm in that area to South Anderson. I don't know exactly when. And at first they rented one or more houses, I'm not sure about that. But he became a driver of an oil truck for a local company, and he also was a minister in the Pentecostal faith, and I think he may have actually founded a Pentecostal church in South Anderson, the father. His mother sold, while the kids were young, sold clothes and home goods out of the trunk of her car to help support the family. Their first son was James, as already been mentioned, and by the time, or shortly after the second son, Joel, who was actually named Jewel, Jewel, and by the time he was in high school, that spelling had altered to Juel, and so I searched for him in that Anderson history and could not find him until I figured out the spelling difference. And a reason I couldn't find him under Williamson was that the editor had put the hyphen as part of the name, and so it didn't show up as Williamson. But anyway, after Joel was born, they figured out what district they should live in for the very best schools possible. And they intentionally found the least expensive house in that community bought it and moved into it. And Joel, incidentally, was born at home in one of those rental properties, and the doctor was running late, so a woman friend helped with the delivery. So the spelling altered to Juel while he was in high school, and later we think when he went to the University of South Carolina, he was in line for some sort of registration or something, and there was a question about the spelling of his name, and he quickly conferred with his father, and his father approved to change it to Joel, and from there on he was Joel Williams. They lived, the house they bought was at 560 Marshall Avenue, and the parents lived there until they became too ill to be there. I believe June took care of one or the other. Can't remember whether it was the father or the mother. Somebody say?
My mother.
Mother.
My mother did.
Okay.
Take care of Granddaddy Williamson.
Okay. But they, because they continued to live there in Anderson, he and his family visited Anderson often, and they have the children whom we got to interview, gratefully, have very fond memories of visiting Anderson and relatives. He was a typical child in that he enjoyed reading comics and listening to programs on the radio. You'll hear a little bit next time about one program in particular that he loved to recall to his children long after it was no longer in existence. There's information on that slide that is a puzzle. It shows that he was in Boys High 44, 45, and 46. Well, he earned a BA degree from University of South Carolina in 48. So either he really was a super genius, or else there's an error in the yearbook. I don't know which. But he did attend, with the help of a lawyer friend of his father, he was able to enter the University of South Carolina and got a BA in history in 48 and an MA in history in 51. Then, as is true of both the other authors we're talking about, he went into the military. He went into the Navy as an officer, and that movement or that activity greatly influenced the rest of his life in at least three important ways. First, one of his places of station was Germany, and he just happened to be invited to a party where he met a young woman named Marie, and they fell in love, married, and ended up having 3 children, 2 girls and a boy, and their names are, find them right quick. Joel, William, and Aletha. And we had a wonderful over 2-hour Zoom interview with the 3 of them, and much of what I'm sharing here today we learned from them. But it was delightful. I think we view this as an ongoing experience, and we would like to continue communicating with them. Marie, at the time he met her, was a civilian nurse working with the Army, with the Navy. Correction, it was working with the Army, but he was in the Navy. And she was also a part-time student. She was from Connecticut, and the children said that she was a typical Yankee. Pardon?
Laugh. It's true.
I'm halfway through. One of the things that they talked about that especially impressed me was that at one point, Joel, the oldest child, had to leave home and go and be in a hospital for a while. And it was far enough away that the parents could not visit very often. And at that time, Guy, who was much older, obviously, started writing letters to her. And somewhere Guy has written that he never left a letter unanswered. Anybody who wrote to him, he responded to. The amount of correspondence that he did is just absolutely unbelievable. But anyway, Joelle said that those letters had a strong influence on her sense of self and greatly affected her life. In fact, that conversation we had on Zoom prompted her to look for those letters, and she did find one, but she thinks there are many others in a storage building, and she plans to try to find those because they communicated for the rest of their life, as long as he was alive. The second way that Joel's life was tremendously affected by being in the Navy, especially as an officer, was that it began to open his eyes about the issue of race, and especially in the South. He supervised mixed Navy personnel, and that indeed would become the lifelong subject of all of his study, and he continued to grow and experience different things along the years. And that most of that is reflected in his books, which I'm about to go to next. The third way that being in the Navy greatly influenced him was when he was discharged on the West Coast. So he ended up going to Berkeley to pursue his PhD in history. But he also liked being there because he had a great interest in writing screenplays. He knew of and was friends with James Lee Barrett, who grew up in Anderson. He was actually born, I think, in Charlotte, but he grew up in Anderson, actually attended Anderson College. And he's a well-known and was very successful screenwriter. He wrote the screenplay for Shenandoah, if you've ever seen that. He wrote the original script for Green Berets, but they had some issues with it, and they brought in other writers as well. Anyway, supposedly Joel said, if Jamie Lee can make a success of it, I can too. So he started writing screenplays, but before he had any success with that, either one of his professors or one of his advisors said, you know, you've got a family now, you might want to get serious about this PhD in history as a much more substantial way to support your family. And fortunately for all of us, I think, he took that advice and gave up on the screenwriting. But the children did say they're also going to look to see if they can find any of those screenplays in the storage area. So he ended up writing at least 7 books, maybe more than that, and 2 of which are multiple award-winning books. Two of them were nominated for Pulitzer Prizes. And the first one of those is still considered a seminal book on race issues in the South. You see how thick it is. And that's still available. The second one that was nominated for a Pulitzer Prize, William Faulkner and Southern History. I'm looking forward to reading that one. I've started it, but I haven't found very far. And his final book, Cultural History, is entitled, you ready for this? Elvis Presley, A Southern Life. And by the time he was near, after he had done most of the research for this, he had developed dementia and would likely not have been able to finish it if not for a friend and fellow colleague in journalism from UNC. And so he is also credited with the book. But Joel never forgetting his Southern roots. He managed to get, even though, as far as I've been able to tell, Elvis never visited Anderson. He did perform in Columbia, I think. Maybe that's as close as he got. But despite that, Joel managed to get almost a full page of text in the Elvis book about Anderson specifically. And there it is. He was talking about how Elvis had gotten some early radio play because of a local station that had local sponsors using medicine, in quotes, as their way of earning money. I'll read. You read. All right. In Anderson County, South Carolina, for example, the singing cowboy was called Tex. He performed on WAIM along with his apprentice, Georgia Boy. They were sponsored by Hadacol, a marvelously restorative drink sold by a highly successful entrepreneur who floated into town and began to bottle the product in a small red brick building on South Main Street that had been a corner branch of the Great Atlantic and Pacific Tea Company, the A&P, before the advent of self-service required large stores with grocery carts and checkout stands. The Hadacol man covered all the windows in his building, and the door was always closed as if visitors were not welcome. The contents of Hadacol were both secret and suspect, like Coca-Cola, which many contemporaries thought contained a touch of cocaine. Somehow, local authorities were never able to determine exactly what was in Hadacol or what might be wrong with it. Knowing persons thought that the major active ingredient, unadvertised, was alcohol of a high proof. In any event, many local ladies of undeniable sobriety testified to its great medicinal value. Meanwhile, the Hadacol king bought one of the largest and most famous houses on North Main Street and toured around at least 3 counties in a huge automobile. That's on page 100. And I'd like to have time to share one quick story. His son in the interview said that when his dad was 70, he went to his house and found him high up in a tree, roped in so he wouldn't fall out with a saw, cutting off limbs. And he said, "Dad, you don't need to be up there doing that. Come down." He said, "No, I'm going to stay here until I win a Pulitzer."
I forgot to mention that Lori Ellison brought her personal copy of the Guy Davenport Reader, and she would like anybody here who is in the Davenport 18 group to make some comments, anything you'd like to write about anything that you have learned in the Davenport 18 discussion group, or just comments that you'd like to make about her Uncle Guy. So I'm going to give the book back to Lori, and then she can tell you where she wants you to sign it.
Anywhere you would like. I actually have 2 copies, which is why I'm willing to have people write in 1 copy, and it would just be very interesting. Today I learned things that I did not know. As I said, I only knew him as a child, but he and my mother wrote letters their entire lives. And so Mom always generously, I felt like I knew him much better because I could read about his life every week or every 2 weeks. She just left a letter out for everybody to read. So that was interesting, but I learned things I didn't know today. I appreciate it. Thank you. So I don't even have my name in this book.
Write your name.
Yeah, I will. And Harriet, I know we don't have time for everybody to do this today, but she's a friend, and she has said that she will take care of getting it back to me when you all are done. And if you don't choose to do that's fine too. I just would appreciate anybody who is willing. But I think I will put my name in here.
I have to say, Lori's mother, Gloria, Glow to me, was my neighbor. So I also had the benefit of her calling me sometimes and reading letters to me over the phone from Brother. That's what she called Guy. So thank you all so much for coming today, and I hope you'll come back next Tuesday. And as a little preview of what we're going to talk about next Tuesday, I invite you to use your imaginations. The year is 1938. It is a cold December day in Anderson, South Carolina. Imagine 11-year-old Guy Davenport sitting by the fire in his house at 303 East Franklin Street. This young boy, who was not allowed to start school until he was 7, because in his words, he was thought to be retarded. He is reading a Book of the Month Club selection. It is a biography of Leonardo da Vinci that he borrowed from his Aunt May's next-door neighbor. Imagine young Joel Williamson, Jewel, as his parents named him, and he was called then. Imagine him sitting by the radio in the living room of his house at 560 Marshall Avenue. He turned 9 years old in October, and he is listening to an episode of one of his favorite cowboy programs, The Lone Ranger. And imagine that less than a mile away, 9-year-old Clarence Brown is at the kitchen table in his family's house on McDuffie Street. Several years before, he watched his father draw a circle, put some eyes in it, top it with a triangle, and call it a clown. On this winter day, young Clarence is drawing cartoon figures, a cat and a mouse perhaps. Imagine that this same December day, 47-year-old Russian poet Osip Mandelstam is dying in a transit camp 5,500 miles from his apartment in Voronezh. He was on his way to a hard labor camp in Siberia. This man, who is now acknowledged as the greatest Russian poet of the Stalin era and perhaps the 20th century, had been arrested for composing and in a small gathering reciting a poem that deliberately insulted Stalin. Someone who heard him recite the poem reported him to the secret police, and he was arrested for being an enemy of the people. Stalin sentenced him to oblivion, banned and stopped all publication of his poetry and prose, and deleted his name from Russian history. In the introduction to his biography of Mandelstam, this was first published in 1973, Clarence Brown wrote, "It is finally one of the endless ironies of Mandelstam's fate that this book should have been written where, when, and by whom it was written. The years when this Russian Jew was enduring exile and death for having been a poet of genius were years when all I had to cope with was a Christian childhood in the American South. How is it that 9-year-old Clarence Brown would go on to become the world's pioneer scholar on the life and works of a Russian poet who had ceased to exist? How is it that he would write his award-winning biography, translate his poetry and prose, smuggle out of Russia the memoir written by Mandelstam's widow, and write its introduction?" I forgot to bring it. So this is the book that Clarence Brown has written the introduction to. So we hope you will join us again next week, and we're going to learn some more about Brown and Mandelstam, and we are also going to talk about the friendship and the 60-year correspondence between Guy Davenport and Clarence Brown. So thank you so much for coming. Wow, thank you all for coming. I'm Harriet Ritchie, and to those of you who were not, well, who was not here last week? All right, that's about half of us. All right, just to let you know, it's kind of hard when 3 people are doing a program on 3 people who lived very full and interesting lives. And I'm in Flat Rock, North Carolina now, so it gets kind of complicated. So last week we ran over, so we're going to have just a little bit of that to start with today. So you probably know Doug Davison, John Lasseter. And are there any other people here from the Davenport 18 Reading Group? Julie, Tom, Betty, Ava was in our original group.
Long time ago.
So a bit about the order today. I do want to thank Jacob and the museum for inviting us to do this program, and to Doug, who did this amazing PowerPoint presentation. So I think it's very helpful to have the visual. A bit about the order of the program, since we have a little bit from last week too. I'm going to start with some remarks by June Williamson Hopkins. Two of the men that we're talking about were her uncles. Guy Davenport was her mother's brother. Joel Williamson was her father's brother. So they're her uncles. Lori Allison was here last week. She's June's sister, and they are her uncles also. And I just see Mary Mills, who's also a part of the Davenport 18. So after I read June's remembrances, John Lasseter is going to follow with a reading from one of Guy Davenport's essays. Doug Davidson's going to say a little bit more about Joel Williamson. And then I'm going to do a presentation on Clarence Brown. And then John and I will spend the rest of the time talking about the 60-year correspondence between Clarence Brown and Guy Davenport. Don't worry, we're not going to give you the whole 60 years. And our time, we have to keep it pretty close to the hour, but if anybody wants to talk outside after we finish, we'd love to hear if any of you have remembrances, or you know people, somebody in your family perhaps, had some remembrances of these men. Guy Davenport was born in 1927. Joel Williamson and Clarence Brown were born in 1929. So, from June Hopkins. I'm certain the Davenport 18 knows far more than I do about Uncle Guy's writings. I hope some personal remembrances of mine may be interesting as well as entertaining. Uncle Guy used to spend each summer at my grandmother Mamie's home on East Franklin Street. I assumed this was his break from teaching. I was often there since Mamie took care of me while my mother worked. Uncle Guy also came for Christmas every year. One of my funniest memories is of a meal we all had with my crazy Aunt May, who also lived on East Franklin. None of us wanted to eat with her since she was a terrible cook. For example, she might be making potato salad and reach over and put something ridiculous in the food like carrots or potato chips. On this particular day, Aunt May had given my uncle a small glass of lemonade and a small glass of Coke. This is Uncle Guy. After he finished drinking about half of each, Aunt May simply reached over and poured the two together. I will never forget the look on his face. Consequently, Mamie was never able to persuade Guy to eat with me again. I believe that May is mentioned in some of Guy's writings. Uncle Guy always came to Anderson a few days before Christmas. He would walk downtown to buy gifts for us, then return home to Mamie's to wrap them. You will be surprised to know that I normally got a very nice book and some art supplies, probably from Fant's bookstore. Mom and Mamie usually got something wonderful like crystal or china. I don't really remember what others got. We ate with Mamie and opened gifts on Christmas Eve. My family usually gave Uncle Guy clothes, which he humorously put on right after opening. He might end up with 2 shirts, 2 sweaters, and 3 scarves on. Speaking of clothing, I remember a funny episode in Lexington, Kentucky, when Mom and my sister Lori and I went up to visit. We always stayed in a nice hotel nearby, since Mom said there were too many insects in Uncle Guy's house. He actually kept sugar water around the house to attract ants. Plus, we were not invited to stay at his house. He only had 1 single bed. Bonnie Jean Cox, she was his partner for 40 years, was at the house also when we were making plans to go out to dinner to a very nice restaurant, Guy's Treat. Uncle Guy came out wearing a very ragged old outfit, and Bonnie Jean said, "Guy, go change clothes." I think many people are curious about the 40-year relationship between Guy and Bonnie Jean. They never lived in the same house, but were together often, usually eating meals together, going to movies. Bonnie Jean told me that Eudora Welty came to dinner one night, and they went to the movies together. Later, I'll have something that Guy Davenport wrote to Clarence Brown about his visit with Eudora Welty. For all appearances, Guy and Bonnie had a very loving relationship. Bonnie was a student at UK when she first saw Uncle Guy. She said she loved him at first sight. According to my mother, they would get into fights, however, and not speak for a few days, but always got back together. Believe it or not, when we saw them together, they would hold hands and talk sweetly to each other. Gloria, Laurie, and my brother Henry and I went to see Uncle Guy for the last time shortly before he died. My mother lined Laurie and me and Henry up in front of Guy and said, "Oh, what a lovely family I have." Uncle Guy, who retained his sense of humor to the end of his life, looked at us and said, "Some look better than others." I have Uncle Guy and Bonnie Jean's ashes at my home in Hendersonville, North Carolina. At some point, I would like to spread their ashes together in Paris. Bonnie Jean said they absolutely loved their trips to Paris. I like to envision the two of them sitting now in a small bistro in Paris, drinking coffee and talking to other poets and artists. And here's her letter, her memories of her Uncle Joel. I do not have many direct memories of Uncle Joel, as I saw very little of him in my childhood. I do remember how handsome he looked in his Navy uniform on the few occasions I saw him at my grandmother Carrie and grandfather Henry's home. We lived next door to them on Marshall Avenue. I remember that Uncle Joel had a cool Ford convertible in which he took me for a ride. He would cause the car to get a wheel to make me laugh. I remember my grandparents driving all the way to California to visit Joel, who had children by that time. I believe he was teaching or studying at Berkeley. My grandparents were very proud of how brilliant he was in his having a doctorate. I remember my grandfather Henry once said that Joel had an IQ of 200. I'm not sure that's possible, since genius is usually about 140 or 150, 160. My dad James always said Joel was a very good card player and earned his way through college gambling. I do not know if this is true, but I'm certain he had a great memory and would know which cards had been played. My grandparents always said that Uncle Joel had serious digestive issues as a young child and survived mainly on bananas. My dad said he used to tease Uncle Joel about being adopted to the point of making him cry, but Uncle Joel, all he really had to do to disprove this was to look in the mirror. He and my dad looked just alike. I remember that my grandmother Carrie often referred to Uncle Joel as Juggy. I understand that my precious cousin Joelle talked with you about her dad. She is Joel's daughter, and Joelle the daughter and one of his other daughters, Aletha, and his son Willie, all Zoomed with us and told us some of their stories about their dad. And then June says at the end, "Thank you for letting me share my memories of my brilliant uncles, who were just as human as the rest of us, with all the ups and downs, loves and hurts that we all have." Okay, so.
The program says that these are going to be readings of Guy Davenport's essays, plural. I think in the interest of time, I'm going to read to you the first two paragraphs of one of my favorite stories, and I was here last week this time. I think these are the two readings that tie him most closely to this town where we live, to Anderson. And if you have, I think I put in a plug for Eric Reese's, he collected, well, it's called The Guy Davenport Reader. It's an anthology of essays and some fiction, passages from his travel journals. It's an interesting array, a very well chosen array of the writings of Davenport. And if you have your copy, you can turn to page 293 and follow me along and see how many mistakes I make. I'm reading this from a photocopy that I can hold close to my face. Anyway, the essay I chose is on reading. The other one was called Finding, and I encourage you to read them both. And again, Finding is also in Reese's anthology. Now, I hope June is listening to this, maybe when she gets to watch the video. It begins, "To my Aunt May." There she is, crazy old Aunt May. Mary Elizabeth Davenport Morrow. He gives her dates, 1881 to 1964. Whose diary, when I saw it after her death, turned out to be a list of places with dates she and Uncle Buzzy, Julian Allen Morrow, 1885 to 1970, had visited over the years, never driving over 30 miles an hour. Places like Toccoa Falls, Georgia, and Andreville, South Carolina, as well as random sentences athwart the page, two of which face down indifference. Here's one of them. My father, this is in quotes, my father was a horse doctor, but not a common horse doctor. And nobody has ever loved me as much as I have loved them. And are you following this sentence? The subject of the sentence, or the beginning of the sentence says, "To my Aunt May," and then there's a dash. And all that I just read comes after that. So here's the rest of the sentence. And a Mrs. Cora Shiflett, a neighbor on East Franklin Street, and we talked last week about the Davenport residence. You can see it, a lovely house, sitting in this, I think, very nice neighborhood. It's one of my favorite places to go to. Anyway, he says, to those two people, Aunt May and Mrs. Cora Shiflett, I owe my love of reading. Mrs. Shiflett, one of that extensive clan of the name, all retaining to this day the crofter mentality of the Scots lowlands from which they came, a mixture of rapacity. Is it rapacity or rapacity? Nobody's telling me. Faulkner called them Snopes, S-N-O-P-E-S, had rented a house across the street from us. These are all people we're reading about in this essay were all neighbors of Guy when he was growing up. They rented a house across the street from us, formerly occupied as long as I could remember by another widow, Mrs. Spoon, and in parentheses it says in quotes with an E, so you don't spell it like the utensil. She and her son, whom we never saw, as he was doing 10 years in the penitentiary. That was the way she pronounced it. But before Mrs. Shiflett's son, as, in quotes here, as good a boy to his mother as ever was, fell into some snare of the law, he had become a great reader. And one fateful day, Mrs. Shiflett, who wore a bonnet and apron to authenticate her respectability as a good countrywoman, brought with her brought to one of her many visits to set a spell with my mother, a Sorry about that. A volume of, and some of you know what I'm getting ready to say, a volume of the Tarzan series, one in which Tarzan saves himself from perishing of thirst in the Sahara by braining a vulture and drinking its blood. She lent it to me, and this is quoting her. Hit, H-I-T, Hit were one of the books Clyde loved in particular. Now, I'm going to stop there and hope that that little sample entices you to we'll say, check out Reese's Davenport Reader and read the rest of this essay. It is charming, and it really is about this. I think I said last week, and I'll say it again, Guy Davenport did not like to be classified as a Southern author. But when you read these two essays, you see that he has Anderson in him. He has these memories of a very Southern town. And this is going to come up later in what I'm going to read to you at the end of the program from his letters, where he was very honest with Clarence Brown. Too honest sometimes. Okay. Everything I know about it is at the bottom of the page. This is a self-portrait. And somebody who knows art history can tell me in what style that is painted. I won't hazard a guess there, but that was a gift to Clarence Brown. And after his death, his widow, you can read it there, donated it to the Graphic Arts collection at Princeton University, and that's where it is to this day. We'll come back to that quotation.
Right. Most of my presentation was last week, but I wanted to just recap very briefly and to re-emphasize Joel Williamson's lifelong contributions to his major topic of interest, and that is race relations, primarily for the American South. It resulted in 5 of his 7 books, foremost The Crucible of Race, a seminal work on the topic, winner of multiple awards, including nomination for a Pulitzer Prize. Oxford Press published an abridged version called A Rage for Order, which was intended to be used for classroom teaching of the subject. He also did 3 other books related to that, and race is even a minor topic in his last 2 books, William Faulkner and the South, and even the Elvis book a little bit. All of this grew out of his service as a naval officer and his work with other seamen, and his willingness to question the assumptions he had been exposed to and adopted as he grew up. It's a great legacy and one that deserves to be celebrated.
Oh, you read that for me?
Oh, okay. Just take it, you tell me. You want it? This down. And
Get ready, I'm not going to be that short. Theirs, as I said, theirs was from last week. And so, as you probably know, the 3 men all went to Boys High School, and they were born within 2 years of each other. Hope Against Hope, written by Nadezhda Mandelstam, was published in English for the first time in 1970. It has been called one of the greatest testaments to the value of literature and intellectual freedom ever written. It is the gripping and brilliantly written account of the silencing of intellectual life and the terror and abject poverty of daily life under the Stalin regime. Far more than a testimony to the tales of a particular time, the story is a view of history in the light of conscience and culture and the challenge of hope in the face of relentless despair. That would be enough to make it important and worthy of reading. But it is also Nadezhda Mandelstam's personal story of her heroic efforts to protect and preserve the poetry and other writings of her husband, Russian poet Osip Mandelstam. He was a widely read, brilliant young Russian poet who refused to compromise his values and who believed that to bow to Stalin was a crime against himself. He was already being watched by the KGB because he refused to join the Union of Soviet Writers. He not only refused, he deliberately wrote a poem that he recited to a small gathering of friends that absolutely calls Stalin the worst of the worst. Someone in the group reported it to the authorities, and he was arrested in 1934. At that point, it was only a matter of time before he would be officially silenced, and his name would be deleted from Russian history. He died on the way to a hard labor camp in Siberia just before his 48th birthday in 1938, and for the next 20 years, it would be a crime to possess anything that he had written. I read Hope Against Hope. This is the book this is a copy of the book that I read just before we moved to Anderson in 1980. It gave me the shivers to read an eyewitness account of what can happen to the powerless in all walks of life in the face of unchecked centralized power, when individual freedom is not valued and there is no freedom of the press. The shivers in particular, because I was writing a lot at that time. The paranoia that takes possession of everyone because no one can be trusted and no one is safe from the knock on the door. Not only that, it is the personal story of a woman. This is a personal story of a woman who made a heroic effort to protect and preserve her her husband's poems, and endured mental anguish and poverty. She tried to save all of his writings from destruction, and this has never left me. A woman who spent 2 decades hiding what was left of his poems and prose. She recited his poems over and over every day for 20 years, leading a nomadic life, moving from job to job, expecting a rest, and depending on the help of her friends. It was not until 1964 that she was allowed to return to Moscow. Several years after reading Hope Against Hope, at the time when we had 2 kids in college and no money to spare, I paid $55 for this tattered edition because it was the least expensive copy I could find. I'm happy to say now that it is widely available in paperback. Why have I told you this? The manuscript for this memoir, which captured the imagination of the Western world when it was published in 1970, had been handed by Nadezhda Mandelstam in 1966 to Clarence Brown in her apartment in Moscow, and he risked his life and smuggled it out of Russia. It was Brown who wrote the 8-page introduction to the book and whose words cover the entire back of the dust jacket of the first edition. With the exception of visiting professorships, including one at Berkeley, Brown spent his teaching career in the Department of Slavic Studies and eventually the Department of Comparative Literature at Princeton University. Born in 1929, he was the son of Clarence Fleetwood Brown Sr. and Mildred Cunningham Brown. He went to Boys High, where he was editor of the newspaper, The Yellow Jacket, and on to Duke University, where he earned a degree in the classics. He was drafted and served 3 years in the Army Security Agency, which included a year of intensive training in the Russian language at Army Language School. The Army sent him to Germany in 1952, where he served as translator. Upon discharge, he enrolled in the University of Michigan, earned a master's in linguistics, and then earned a PhD in Russian literature from Harvard. He was hired at Princeton University as an instructor in 1959 before he finished his dissertation. By the time Brown retired from Princeton in 1991, he and his Belgian-born wife, Jacqueline, moved to Seattle. Brown had visited Russia multiple times, and during his 20-year search for anything and everything he could find about Osip Mandelstam. 2 of Brown's Harvard professors had suggested Mandelstam to him as the possible topic for his dissertation. Brown would go on to write the dissertation, which required translating everything Mandelstam had ever written, his poetry, his prose, everything, because there was nothing published at that time except a few things that had been smuggled into New York from Russia, but they were still in Russian. So there was nothing available that was in the English language. Let's see if I can work this. Am I going backward?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm going to move this, and you can follow it along if you can. It just keeps me from saying so much. This is a little bit about Mandelstam. When Stalin dies, and there's a second a minor cultural thaw, and then this is where I'm now. The collected works is published in Russian in New York. So, all right. So Brown goes to Russia, and then he begins to publish, to translate and publish Mandelstam's work. The first is the prose of Mandelstam, which was a finalist for the American Book Award. Then in 1973, the first edition of his biography of Mandelstam came out. It again was awarded the Goss Award for Literary Criticism. And then he and W.S. Merwin, a poet who had also been at Harvard when he was there, published the selected poems. Okay. Among other things, he edited and translated the portable 20th Century Russian Reader in '85. And also in '93, he translated and wrote the introduction for a dystopian novel called We that had been out of print for something like 88 years. Brown also had a career as a cartoonist, and I think you can guess since I went the wrong way. That's Brown at his desk. His cartoons were published in the likes of Esquire, Playboy, the National Lampoon, to name a few. He drew cartoons for his column Ink Soup in the Trenton Times, New Jersey. He also served as cartoon editor of the Saturday Review from 1977 to 1984. I wasn't able to reproduce my favorite Brown cartoon. It's titled Common Mistakes by Authors. And it shows a man browsing in a second-hand bookstore. And he picks up a book from a table where there's a sign that says, every book on this table, 50 cents. And he opens this particular book and he exclaims, "But this is the book I inscribed to my mother." His work as a cartoonist was profiled in 1984 in the New York Times in an article titled, "Cartoons, a Serious Business for a Princeton Professor." When Brown died in Seattle in 2015 after a long illness, his tributes from his professional colleagues and former students were many. Not only was he recalled as a legend, one who actually knew the Russian literary figures that they were studying about. They praised his abilities as a teacher, the beautiful way he read poetry, his sense of humor, and his amusing instructional chalkboard sketches he drew while he was lecturing. His seminars on dystopian and science fiction, and on the art and history of the American newspaper cartoon, which he called one of the original American art forms, the other two being jazz and the movies. He was long admired for his literary genius in his chosen field, the interpretation of modern Russian literature. Before I turn briefly to Brown and the story of the Mandelstams again, I'd like to read a few sentences that he wrote in his Ink Suit column in the Trenton Times, and it was reprinted in the Princeton Alumni Weekly. And I think it kind of follows on this program what Doug said about Joel Williamson and race. The title of this is My Black Grandmother. His family lived on McDuffie Street and his grandparents lived on Main Street. And apparently at that time there wasn't much between the two. A branch of the pear tree hung low across the path that led from my grandmother's house to ours. This was inconvenient for adults, but for me it was the right height for swinging. And he says that led from my grandmother's house. And then shortly thereafter he says, my grandmother was black and ruled over one of the grand houses on Main Street. These facts will seem discordant given my white skin. She was not biologically my grandmother, but biology is very small potatoes when set beside emotions, and emotionally, Corey Scott was everything to me. He goes on to say, to talk a little bit about Corey and how she became his grandmother. His grandparents took Corey in when she was a child, and they raised her, and then she ended up taking care of his grandmother. He says, when I read the Old Testament today, I hear the words in her voice, though she required no written text on a summer night with my head in her lap. She would ask me to try to count the stars of the sky. I had a child's fondness for God because Corey seemed to like him. And he says at the end, Corey Scott's personal history was a tiny gap in a void the size of creation itself. It is still, however, her beloved voice that the book of Genesis comes back to me. I will bless thee and make thy name great, and thou shalt be a blessing. Perhaps Corey's voice has not been lost. And if we listen closely, we can hear her voice in the writing voice of Clarence Brown. So back to the Mandelstams briefly. Let's see. Oh. All right, I'll just leave it on Nadezhda. So when Brown was searching for his information, nobody even knew if Nadezhda Mandelstam was still alive. Nobody in Russia knew if she was still alive because she was hiding. He eventually found the acclaimed and also silenced poet Anna Akhmatova. They were Mandelstam's closest friends. She was present when he was arrested the first time. And it was she who in 1962 told Brown that Nadezhda, Mandelstam's widow, was still alive. Brown would go on to meet and befriend Nadezhda and spend hours at her kitchen table reading her manuscript. She had made several copies, and she hoped to get them out somewhere, but they would have to be smuggled. This was back in the day when you had to make carbon copies on thin paper. In an article, Memories of Nadezhda, Brown recalls leaving her tiny, very tiny apartment, the size of a large bathroom, with the manuscript. He recalls seeing 4 men watching him from the dark corners of the courtyard and wondering how old his 8-year-old son might be when he saw him again, if ever. In the early 1980s, Betty Young introduced me to her friend, Mildred Brown, Clarence Brown's mother. Why Mildred Brown decided that I should meet son Clarence the next time he visited her is too long a story to tell. But he was a good son and agreed to meet me at the library when it was right here. I've tried to figure out where we were. We were across from the circulation desk, but I can't figure out where the circulation desk was then. But I remember the corner where we sat, and I've tried to place it in the context of the museum. I deeply regret that I did not know what I know now, how he risked his life to find Nadezhda Mandelstam and help her bring back from oblivion the man who is now celebrated as the greatest Russian writer of the Stalin era. Therefore, the questions I asked Brown that day were not the questions I would ask him now. The main one: when did he understand the importance that his dissertation, his biography of Mandelstam, and his translations would mean to the world of literature? Did he imagine that Nadezhda Mandelstam's manuscript, which he smuggled out of Russia, would eventually be translated into every major language, and Nadezhda herself would become known worldwide? I checked online this morning, and the first thing I pulled up was a January seminar in the humanities on this very book and the impact of totalitarian regimes on art. Because of Clarence Brown, Nadezhda Mandelstam donated the papers of her husband, which she had protected and preserved, to the archives of Princeton University. They were smuggled out of Russia in suitcases, first to Paris and then to Princeton by a joint effort between Princeton and others. Brown was the first curator of the papers and kept one of the suitcases. I'm going to give Guy Davenport, Brown's lifelong friend, the last word, almost. Davenport wrote this review of Brown's biography of Mandelstam, which is here. Thanks to Gail Edwards, I have now a first edition signed copy by Clarence Brown. It was her book. So in the review, in the Hudson Review, this is what Davenport wrote. There is no greater success for scholarship than to recover, establish, and interpret an unknown figure. And Clarence Brown is a prose stylist of the first rank. For what rarer than a scholar who can write lucid, strong, and graceful prose? He has a great deal of Mandelstam wit and sense of the absurd. He has the unflagging curiosity to have tracked down everything trackable down. But the triumph is to have written a book, every detail of which is new and strange to the majority of its readers, which keeps matters clear, efficient, organized, and handsomely rendered. Down. That's a... All right. So 1991. There was a centennial celebration in January of the 100th birthday of Osip Mandelstam. His portrait appears in newspapers, on kiosks, and even commemorative postcards. There was an exhibition on 2 entire floors of the State Literary Museum. They included photocopies of some of the poet's archives that were smuggled from Russia to Princeton. Clarence Brown was the speaker, and he spoke in the enormous hall of the Writers' Union of Russia. He says and this is in the introduction of, I think, the 2002 edition of his translation, the prose of Osip Mandelstam, and so he notes that he was there in January. They were finally celebrating Mandelstam. That was January 91. And then his last sentence is, in December 1991, the USSR was no more. In other words, Mandelstam was no more, and he and Nadezhda had brought him back to life. And then by the end of that very same year, the USSR dissolved. So that's all. That's where we're going to leave it. We're going to move on then, and I wish somebody else could talk right now. But we're going to move on to the next part of the program, which is talking about the letters that were exchanged from 1945 to 2005 that we know of from Clarence Brown and Guy Davenport. John and I did not know what we were getting into when we decided we wanted to get some of these letters. But I mean, we had these grand ideas that maybe, you know, we would do something with them. And then finally I said, I'm too old. And then John said, well, even I would have to have an entire staff of people if we went through all of this. Plus, you have to, after like 100 digital pages, you have to pay. So, but anyway, I think we've had fun with this. Let's see. I said I was going to go through these and just look for the fun stuff. And I at first thought, well, I would do it by subject, like humor, people, pets, or, you know, whatever. But I had to abandon that. But there is one line I just have to tell you that Brown wrote to Davenport, May 24th, 1962. He said, "It was nice to hear from you again. Just the list of your activities, makes me want to lie down somewhere." Also, It worked. In a postcard from Hampstead Heath in London, Brown wrote Davenport, probably the summer of 1969, when he was working on his manuscript for the biography of Mandelstam, "Where are you? Were you not to appear one morning on the front stoop? Since the trunk came with my papers, I had been rising at 4, stewing up here in the garret until 11, and when the morning's production seemed worth it, walking to the pub for lunch. And when it isn't, running to the pub. No one will ever finish the stuff I've done. Write to me." And the next, this for anybody who has written or wants to write or publish, this should give you hope. He has just said nobody is ever going to publish this. The next one is from the introduction of the biography of Mandelstam, published 4 years later. And this is what Brown writes. "It is finally one of the endless ironies of Mandelstam's fate that this book should be written where, when, and by whom it was written. The years when this Russian Jew was enduring exile and death for having been a poet of genius were years when all I had to cope with was a Christian childhood in the American South." I had mentioned earlier Eudora Welty. So I'm going to try to find where I have the what Guy Davenport wrote to her. This is a copy of a letter that he wrote on July 29, 2001. She had died on July 23. Once after, he said Eudora's demise was not unexpected, so he must have been in touch. Once after Eudora had done a talk to local creative writers, I took her arm to lead her out of the conference room and to lunch. A female dragon of the local creative writers spat at me. "Who are you?" Eudora said, "Why, this is Guy Davenport, the writer of note." She said later that she had never actually said "of note" before, but she thought it sounded right for the occasion. She paid me a compliment on my story, John Charles Tapner, with its mesmerizing details. It was a shock to me that she had read it. Her first evening here in 1964, we went to a Beatles movie, and afterwards she regaled with us at Beatles lore. And really quickly, I want to tell you that when Clarence Brown met Anna Akhmatova, she was a person who was very distant and who just didn't suffer fools. And she was actually so impressed that he was looking for Mandelstam and that he cared so much about him that she agreed to meet him a second time. She herself had been silenced. Her husband had been shot. Her son had been imprisoned. She had spent 17 months standing in line trying to get word of him. And so, as I said, she was the Mandelstam's best friend. After Clarence Brown met her, he wrote Guy Davenport about the meeting. And he said this beautiful sentence that about her agreeing to see him again. And he said, she loved him, speaking of Mandelstam. She loved him, and I loved him. And she loved me because I loved him. John?
Harry, what's the name of the piece that Davenport wrote about Mandelstam in the Geography of the Imagination? Can you address
well, you know, I was going to give him the last, well, that was what I read at the end when I said I was giving him the last word.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
That,
yeah.
What's the name of
Oh, the name of it?
Yeah.
A man with no contemporaries, or is it? It's a man. It's somebody with no contemporaries. I think it's a man.
Yeah.
A man without contemporaries.
This is the book I'm talking about. That essay is in the Geography of the Imagination. This is, and I told the group who was here last week that that's a new edition. It came out in 2024. And I love that picture of Davenport. It's better than the one, I think Harriet and I certainly agree on this, that's on the cover of Eric Rees's Eric Rees's Reader. I'm trying to make sure I'm not going to go over time. Anyway, I quoted from John Jeremiah Sullivan. He's the person who came out with this edition and wrote a magnificent introduction to the book. And really, that introduction is worth the price of the book. It's wonderful. And the same goes for Eric Rees's book. He has an afterword that is a remembrance of Guy Davenport, and it just is absolutely beautiful. Anyway, I'm going to, first of all, introduce the sources of these letters. You know, I went to graduate school for, I lose count of how many years, with the idea that I would one day be a published scholar. And instead, I realized my calling was to teaching, and that's how I ended up at Anderson University for 30-some years. Anyway, I always dreamed of being a scholar, and I pictured myself in places like the reading room of the old British Museum, which back then was the British Library. Now the two have separated. The British Museum is totally a museum, and the British Library has moved up a couple of miles. But anyway, I pictured myself doing what scholars, well, I'll say did during my days of education and much of the teaching, which was sitting in libraries, working with manuscripts. And Harriet and I came as close to doing that as, well, I don't know. When I did my dissertation, I was going through very dusty archives and country houses and county record offices in England. But anyway, the letters, and I'm talking about the originals, are housed in two locations. Davenport's, now this can sound a little confusing, Davenport's letters are in the Clarence Brown papers, and they're housed at Princeton University's library, Princeton University Library Special Collections Department, and Brown's letters are in the Guy Davenport papers. I mean, that's the way it works. When somebody sends you a letter, it becomes your property, and so when you die and leave your stuff, it's in among your belongings. Anyway, Davenport's papers are housed in the Harry Ransom Center, and we talked about that a little bit 2 weeks ago. I mean, about a week ago, at the University of Texas at Austin. Anyway, listen to this. In both collections, and this gave us a ray of hope, in both collections, the correspondence begins in 1945 with Davenport, who was then 17. Remember, he left Boys High. He went to Duke University shortly after he had turned 17. He was a freshman at Duke, and Clarence Brown, at age 16, now if you look at their dates, they were born 2 years apart, but there's an overlap when they were 1 year apart in terms of the answer they gave to how old are you.
Davenport didn't start to school until he was 7.
Yeah, right. But anyway, and as Harriet has already pointed out, Clarence Brown was serving at the time. In 1945, he was serving as the editor of the school newspaper, the Yellow Jacket. Now, Harriet and I were hoping that this was when they both began writing to each other, and that with both collections at hand, we were really looking forward to this, we would be reading in sequence a letter from one followed by a response from the other, and so on, back and forth like a conversation by mail, with their long-distance friendship. And it was a long way, I can testify to this, from Anderson to Durham. Their long-distance friendship was growing with each exchange. Well, we were to be disappointed on all 3 counts. Now, that doesn't mean we were grieving and were ready to give it up. It just created a different challenge, and this is what you have to come to expect. So listen carefully to this. The letters begin in medias res, in the middle of things. Starting with one from Davenport, and the date is interesting. It was VJ Day, August 14th, 1945. And in this letter, he made it clear that they had already been corresponding for some time. So these were not this was not their first exchange of letters. And listen to this. And that their friendship had apparently waxed and waned over that time. Anyway, here's how this 4-page handwritten letter begins. And my plan here is, if I don't run out of time, is to read small selections from these letters. And so he begins in French. That's not surprising, is it? Davenport says, "Mon cher Clarence, Mr. Editor, last night," and this is so dramatic to me, "last night we celebrated the end of the war. Today, at Duke, remember, there are no classes." A few lines later, and here I need to find that quotation. Which button do I push? That. I don't know if you know the name Blackburn, but he was a very well-known and well-respected professor of English at Duke. And while I'm going on about this, you can read what the sort of insulting thing. I think if I had said this about one of my professors, they might have revoked my degree. But anyway, a few lines later, we get a hint that there were some problems. In my last letter, this is Davenport writing to, if my last letter was tinted, T-I-N-T-E-D, with disrespect and contempt, what do you suppose was in that letter? I guess we'll never know. I hope that you will see your way to pardoning me. He's asking for forgiveness. And as you say that you still have hope of my complying with your request, feel sure that you shall not be disappointed. As the letter progresses, it soon becomes apparent that Brown is having difficulty as editor of the Yellow Jacket, discerning the expectations of his readers. And Davenport, who before his departure from Boys High served on the editorial staff, is offering advice. Poll your readers, he says, and offers a list of the kinds of questions he needs to ask. For example, did you read all of the paper? Are the news stories concise and easy to read? And this must have been hurtful to Clarence. Was the editorial cartoon understandable. He drew cartoons for the Yellow Jacket, right? And et cetera, et cetera. There were a bunch of questions that Davenport said he should ask in polling. He didn't say how Brown was supposed to do that. By the time Clarence gets to page 4 of this letter, and the last paragraph of the letter, Guy is giving him life advice, a kind of practical philosophy by which to live his life. And in this paragraph, Davenport gets off to an amusing but also, I think, poignant start before doling out specific advice. Listen to this, quote, I guard your letters between the pages of Whitman's Leaves of Grass, what a place to stash things, and reread them when I am tired and lost. But then, this is important, then the tone changes abruptly and sharply. Here's what he says. Watch close and make sure that the cheapness and vice of Anderson does not keep the polish off your brain, make you self-conscious and ashamed to speak your mind, cramp your desires and dampen your ambitions. To many this happens. To you it cannot. Look about you and observe those who are caught in the strangling throes of convention. That's vintage Davenport. Abruptly he ends the letter. I must go. Adieu. I think this passage tells us more about Davenport himself than it does about Brown or the city in which they were both born and grew up. It sheds light on the principles that in the years to come would inform his own values and shape his writing. I would add that if Anderson in the mid-1940s was indeed a place of cheapness and vice, and that caught its citizens in the strangling throes of convention, we can trust, or maybe I should say we can hope, it is no longer like that today. Anyway, if this advice made a lasting impression on Brown, there's no mention of it at all in the pages, in the one-page typed letter that he sent to Davenport 10 days later on August 24th, nor any evidence that he had taken that advice to heart. His concerns continue to be practical, having to do with, everybody say it now, the Yellow Jacket. He had just, quote, dropped by to see the Altmans, and I had to look them up. You may know, if you're a long-time Anderson resident, that this was a company, a printer's company, and they printed the Yellow Jacket. They were the ones who did. And here's what poor Clarence is writing to Guy after that really sort of disturbing letter that he should have already had in hand. They had some news for me, bad news. They said it would be impossible for them to print the paper at last year's prices. Last year, $32. This year, $50. And we're complaining about inflation these days. That's inflating. We will have to pay he's done the math, $18 more per issue than this year than last. And he goes on to say, I'm not very familiar with the financial setup of the paper, but it seems to me that we have come to a point where we must, this sounds like a politician, doesn't it, augment our means or diminish our wants. And he signs the letter, and I noticed that he and Davenport frequently sign these letters with love. Do men do that anymore? I don't think we do. He signs the letter love, and in all lowercase type, C for Clarence, Fleetwood Brown. And I thought Fleetwood at first. Fleetwood was a fictitious comic name, but it's his middle name. And you said it was his father's name as well. Anyway, the next letter from Davenport is dated November 4th, 1945. In it, we learn that Brown has just visited Davenport at Duke, and he's writing Clarence. Clarence has just left. says, Dear Clarence, Irving, and that was Davenport's your roommate, Irving said that he heard you come in this morning and bring the key and get your yellow pajamas. Sorry I wasn't awake to see you off. Is that rude, or is that rude? But I suppose you got home all right without too much misadventure. It was a pleasure having you here. And listen to this. And I hope that I can be here when you come 3 semesters from now, September 1946. And here it's worth noting, I think Harriet's already pointed out, that Brown would indeed follow Davenport to Duke, just as later he would follow him to Harvard, where both men received their doctorates in 1961, that's Davenport, and 1962, Brown, respectively. Anyway, back to the November 4th letter. It provides a glimpse of his life at Duke, and that's why I have that quotation up on the screen. For instance, that morning, not long after Clarence had left, listen to this, he read the book of Ruth and some more in Darwin. That's an interesting combination, don't you? He also reported to Brown that all last semester, in my spare time, he laid out for himself a system of life, he called it. It took the form of an outline of his personal academic goals, which each followed by a list of what he must learn to do to achieve them. For example, at the beginning came letter A. The heading was Attitude and Ethics, under which he lists 2 things. 1, learn the Bible thoroughly, and that's a tall order. And 2, follow the teachings of Jesus the Christ. And I've speculated that that might have been the seed for this little book. Does anybody know this book? It is a translation. It's called the Logia of Yeshua. Tom, am I pronouncing that correctly? Okay. Which means the sayings of Jesus. It's a collaborative translation of not just the sayings in the Gospels, but the sayings in the apocryphal texts. Anyway, this book was published in 1996. Think about it, that's what, about 50 years later. Time does not permit any further sampling of these, what I find to be wonderful early letters. I will conclude by quoting 2 short passages from Brown. Am I okay for time now?
You have the thing.
Yeah, I wrote down the...
It is past 1 o'clock. Anyone needs to leave, just to let you know.
Okay.
But,
let me do this very quickly. There's a letter from Brown dated 20 December 1965, and really this is just one quotation. It concludes with a heartbreaking sentence that sums up what often happens, I suspect, to friends as they approach middle age. Has this happened to you? And as in the case of Brown, have married, and as with both Brown and Davenport, have settled into the careers that will take them to retirement. In a page-long typed letter full of news of his scholarly activities and accomplishments, as well as expressions of gratitude and admiration for Davenport's work, he gets to the end and he says to his old friend, "You are probably at home. I hate the very numeral that names the years we have not seen each other, and they were living far apart with different lives." This happens all the time, doesn't it? It's a comfortless thought that there are some very old friends who don't have to be seen, who just always are, underlined, are there. The friendship, this is the end of my talk, the friendship documented by the letters contained in these 2 collections lasted until the death from lung cancer of Guy Davenport on January the 4th, 2005. A little more than 3 months after he typed now, he's still typing, though very ill, typed his last 2 letters to Clarence Brown in September of 2004. And one of them ends with these, I think, brave words. I'm damn sick and tired of being an invalid. I'm not, however, depressed or downhearted. And it is signed, 2 words, one on top of the other, anyway. And he puts a dot under the anyway and just the letter G, and he has signed the letter G. Mm-hmm. It's a good farewell to Guy Davenport and to me. Okay.
One last sentence and
This is great.
The fact that these 3 brilliant and internationally renowned individuals were born within 2 years of each other, grew up within 2 miles of each other, were personal friends, and made outstanding contributions in their individual areas of expertise is nothing short of amazing, and likely unparalleled in any other small community outside of Anderson, South Carolina.
Yes.